Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the Library of Congress program, Behind the Scenes with the Poet Laureate. My name is Rob Casper. I am the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress, and I am here with the 18th Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, Mr. Philip Levine. Good afternoon, Mr. Poet Laureate.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here.
We are joined by an audience that stretches from New York State to Honolulu, Hawaii, through the medium of video conferencing. Others will be watching this program through a live video stream on the World Wide Web. Today, we'll follow this format. We'll have a brief introduction, and then we'll read 3 of his poems. In this order: What Work Is, The Simple Truth, and Our Valley. We'll have a couple of general questions from our sites that are participating. Then we'll have each poem and a question, and then afterwards we'll have an open question and answer period with our participating sites. I want to extend a warm welcome to all the sites that are participating in today's conference. From East Coast to West Coast, they are Potsdam Public Library in Potsdam, New York. Fox Chapel Area High School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yeah, go Pittsburgh. Windsor Barrow High School in Windsor, Georgia. Capstone Village at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Oh, I see you down there. I like the shout outs. Alpena County George N. Fletcher Library in Alpena, Michigan. Whitmore Branch Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. Star Branch Community Library in Star, Idaho. Brawley Union High School in Brawley, California, which is one of the 2 states that Mr. Levine hails from. Southwest High School in El Centro, California. And finally, Moanalua High School in Honolulu, Hawaii. Aloha! We can actually hear you. Aloha back. We also want to take this opportunity to thank the technical staff at the various institutions that have made this video conference possible. This is a volunteer effort from all concerned, with time and technology donated by the K-20 initiative of Internet 2 and Magpie, the Internet 2 Mid-Atlantic Center based at the University of Pennsylvania. Let me go over how you can ask questions, the participating sites. In anticipation of this event, we have received some questions about Mr. Levine's work, but we welcome more. As I said, we'll ask 2 general questions in the beginning, a question with each poem, and then we'll open up the video conference to your questions. To give everyone the opportunity to ask questions during this program, we're going to do 2 things. One, we have a Twitter account, and you can ask questions throughout the conference via Twitter at this hashtag LCPoetry, LCPOETRY. The other way that you can ask questions is at the end of our conversation. If you're brave enough to stand up and ask the Poet Laureate question yourself, you can do so, and he'll do his best to answer all the questions he can. And again, let me give you that Twitter account. It is hashtag LCPoetry. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce the 18th Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, Philip Levine. He is the author of 20 collections of poetry, including What Work Is, The Simple Truth, and most recently, News of the World. He has received almost every honor an American poet can receive in this country, including a Pulitzer Prize, 2 National Book Awards, 2 National Book Critics Circle Awards. He was a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, and he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is also the author of 3 books of essays, So What? No, how's it? It's
Don't ask.
Yeah, don't ask. It's don't ask and so ask.
Yeah.
Not so what? That's Miles Davis.
Yeah.
And The Bread of Time Towards an Autobiography. He's also a translator. He's been an editor. And for many, many years, he taught at the Creative Writing Program at Cal State University in Fresno. And the Fresno School of Poets really developed around his presence there over many, many decades. He's also a very, very sweet guy and an honest responder to questions. So whatever you want to ask, I'm sure he'll do his best to reply. So if you don't mind saying hello to everybody.
Hello to everybody. I'm happy here to be here and be in contact with you. I haven't done anything like this in years, and never with a national audience. So I'm pleased to give it a try.
Well, thank you very much. And so let me start with our two general questions. First, a question from Moanalua High School. The question is, how do you develop the ideas behind your poems? Do you start with an idea, or do you start with an image that inspires an idea?
I don't think I ever start with an idea. I start either with an image, usually a visual image, or I start with words themselves. Poems, after all, are made out of words and not ideas. And if my imagination catches fire, I produce something out of those initial words or the initial visual imagery that leads to a poem. When you sit down to write a poem, you have no idea really where it's going to go. And when it goes, when the process surprises you, then you do something worthy. If you already know what you're going to do, it's likely to be quite boring. I mean, so every poem is a kind of adventure into the unknown. And a lot of them crash. You know how adventurous airplanes will fall down when they run out of gas. And sometimes I run out of gas. Fuel, I should say. I run out of fuel and nothing comes of it. So it's really from visual imagery or sounds or words themselves. I mean, I could hear someone say something, a little line, and I'll hear in the line, oh, I went shopping yesterday. I'll hear in the line a certain rhythm. And I'll say, that's the way Americans sound. I want to capture that. Oh, I went shopping. And that will lead to a poem.
Well, let's move on to a question from Southwest High School. The question is, what type of educational preparation benefited you the most in producing your poetry?
That's a rather wonderful question, Southwest. I think two things. My high school in Detroit. I had a couple of marvelous teachers, really inspirational teachers, who encouraged me to write and who directed me to texts that would help. The most important was a woman named Mrs. Paperno, who during World War II directed me to the poetry of Wilfred Owen, the great English war poet. And it had such a profound effect on me to discover that, after all, I was growing toward the war. I was 17 years old. The war was going. And I saw in the work of Owen my own feelings about war. Owen died in the war, 1 week before the end of the war. And I saw that not wanting to go to war and not wanting to kill people and not wanting to be killed was utterly valid, in spite of what the Hollywood movies were telling me at the time, that it would be a terrific honor to get blown apart for the state of Michigan. And the other education I got from people I met as a worker, somebody working. I met people that I never would have met in any other context. Certainly not in the university. And I learned a lot about what dignity is and what courage is and how to behave, what decent behavior was, and what was meaningful in my life. From people older than I, more experienced than I, and I must say more generous than I, who shared their learning and their affection for me. And those were the two great sources of my education.
I should say, too, as a follow-up, that Mr. Levine gave an incredible talk last night, his closing talk at the Library of Congress, called My Lost Poets, which includes an anecdote about that teacher. Obviously, you all are across the country and weren't able to come, but we will put up the video webcast online. You can go to www.loc.gov/poetry, and in 6 weeks or so, it'll be up. So it's worth seeing, along with the opening reading of Mr. Levine's tenure as Poet Laureate back in October, which is, in fact, up on our website right now. So we've selected 3 poems for Mr. Levine to read. I believe he read 2 of them at that opening reading. But we're going to start now with a poem called What Work Is, which was from the National Book Award winning collection of the same title. So you all have that poem. And
now they have the poem, so when I make a mistake reading it, you're going to see the mistake. And don't groan too loudly, okay?
We can hear you all.
I'd like to make a few remarks about the poem and where the poem came from. At a certain age, I'm a twin. And there is a lot of feeling in this poem for a brother. And I would say up until I was 14 or 15 years old, my twin brother, was the most important person in my life. But later in life, my brother married and he moved away and I saw less of him. And I used to imagine that I was seeing him all over the place. I'd see somebody who looked like him, and it wasn't him. And that gets into this poem, that close bond that I formed with him, which still exists today. Not as powerfully, of course, as it was when I was 15, but it's still there. A loving, complex relationship with another human being, brotherhood. Let me read the poem. It takes place in Detroit, by the way. Fort Highland Park, Michigan, and Hamtramck, Michigan, are 2 small cities entirely surrounded by the city of Detroit. And Fort Highland Park was once the second largest Ford assembly plant. It is now empty. It's an empty warehouse. I don't even know if it holds anything. It's a huge building with no function. What work is? We stand in the rain in a long line waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. Forget you. This is about waiting, shifting from one foot to another, feeling the light rain falling like mist into your hair, blurring your vision, until you think you see your own brother ahead of you, maybe 10 places. You rub your glasses with your fingers, and of course it's someone else's brother. Narrower across the shoulders than yours, but with the same sad slouch, the grin that does not hide the stubbornness, the sad refusal to give in to rain, to the hours wasted waiting, to the knowledge that somewhere ahead a man is waiting who will say, no, we're not hiring today, for any reason he wants. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother who's not beside you or behind or ahead, because he's home, trying to sleep off a miserable night shift at Cadillac so he can get up before noon to study his German. Works 8 hours a night so he can sing Wagner, the opera you hate most, the worst music ever invented. How long has it been since you told him you loved him? Held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide, and said those words, and maybe kissed his cheek, You've never done something so simple, so obvious. Not because you're too young or too dumb, not because you're jealous or even mean or incapable of crying in the presence of another man. No, just because you don't know what work is.
Well, we have a question from Zihong Zhu at Fox Chapel Area High School on this particular poem. He says, your experience have clearly shaped aspects of your literature in poems such as Work Is. Did the monotony of the job inspire you or allow you to create poetry in your head as you worked? Or is the poetry an attempt to highlight the reality of such an occupation?
There are some things where it's good not to have a large group of people for it.
No, I recognized very quickly not to try to write poems when I was working. Today I went to OSHA, the government outfit that ensures the safety of workers. And that was, trying to write poems while you were doing this kind of work was suicide. You could lose fingers, a hand, God knows what. You had to be, to some degree, alert. So, even when the work was very monotonous, you did not have the luxury of letting your mind wander. What I could do was recite to myself the poems of the great poems of previous poets whose work I had memorized. And sometimes I would do that. I didn't write poetry about Detroit while I worked in Detroit. That is, I didn't write poetry about work until, not any that I liked, until I was probably 33 or 4 and had been away from the city for 7 or 8 years. I couldn't. I didn't understand what happened to me. I couldn't sort my emotions out. I was still too full of anger toward my own exploitation and the exploitation of people I worked with, and the brutality of the work. The work then was not automated. This was a long time ago, you know. It was 60 years ago. And it was hard work. It was heavy work. And I didn't enjoy it, but I needed it to stay alive. So I didn't know I would ever write about those years. And then when I was 33 or 34, I suddenly felt I could deal with it. I can deal with it without rage. I can deal with it with a much fuller notion of what it meant and how in some ways it was a gift, because I met such marvelous people that I worked with, my comrades, my friends. And when I got that vision, as well as the old angers toward, say, General Motors, who I worked for, then I could write about it.
You were for many years a teacher, and I wonder how you dealt with students who were attempting and maybe failing themselves to write about what they knew, write about the experiences they had, and what advice you might give the students we have here in terms of their own writing.
You know, a lot of the students would say to me, you know, I haven't done anything. What am I going to write about? You know, there was a sense that their ignorance of the world or their innocence was depriving them. And the first thing I say to them is, you were a child once. And the magic of childhood is always in your possession. Always. You can always go to that. Your family, the bonding in your family is essential. Also, you have imaginations. In some cases, I would even say that my motto was, Philip, why be yourself if you could be someone interesting? And I acted on that. I would imagine a richer life. or my life tailored so that it had more meaning. Although I would always advise them, start with what you know, but you don't have to stick to that.
That's great, thank you. Why don't we move on to your second poem, The Simple Truth, from the Pulitzer Prize winning collection of the same title as well. You all have the poem. Please go ahead.
A few words about this poem. It's situated in Fresno, California, where I have lived longer than any place else. I settled there when I was 30, and I still live half the year there. It was, when I moved there, a small, relatively small town, 120,000. It's now almost 500,000. It's in the Great Central Valley. It's an interesting, diversified mix of people, quite wonderful. A lot of people from Asia, a lot of people from Mexico, of course, and Latin America, a lot of people from Europe, large Armenian population, the largest in the United States. It's a town that intrigues me. Okay. The simple truth. I bought $1.50 worth of small red potatoes, took them home, boiled them in their jackets, and ate them for dinner with a little butter and salt. Then I walked through the dry fields on the edge of town. In middle June, the light hung on in the dark furrows at my feet, and in the mountain oaks overhead, the birds were gathering for the night. The jays and mockers squawking back and forth, the finches still darting into the dusty light. The woman who sold me the potatoes was from Poland. She was someone out of my childhood in a pink spangled sweater and sunglasses, praising the perfection of all her fruits and vegetables at the roadside stand, and urging me to taste even the pale, raw sweet corn, trucked all the way, she swore, from New Jersey. Eat, eat, she said. Even if you don't, I'll say you did. Some things you know all your life. They are so simple and true, they must be said without elegance, meter, and rhyme. They must be laid on the table beside the salt shaker, the glass of water, the absence of light gathering in the shadows of the picture frame. They must be naked and alone. They must stand for themselves. My friend Henry and I arrived at this together in 1965, before I went away, before he began to kill himself and the two of us to betray our love. Can you taste what I'm saying? It is onions or potatoes, a pinch of simple salt, the wealth of melting butter. It is obvious. It stays in the back of your throat like a truth you never uttered, because the time was always wrong. It stays there for the rest of your life, unspoken, made of that dirt we call earth, the metal we call salt, in a form you have no words for, and you live on it.
Well, thank you for that. We have a question from Ishan Chatterjee at Fox Chapel Area High School about this poem. And the question is, in The Simple Truth, you write, some things you know all your life. They are so simple and true, they must be said without elegance, meter, and rhyme. In what way does putting words in a poetic form change the feeling, the simplicity, or the truth of them? Are there certain topics or words for which poetry is better suited?
I think in the right hands, in the hands of the right poet, any topic is suitable for poetry. There's a certain kind of lyrical poetry, say, dealing with a rural life that I might stay away from because I don't have enough experience as a rural person. But another person could handle it quite well. I think it's impossible for me to imagine any subject that couldn't find its way into a poem if the right person were writing. What was the first part of that question again?
In what way does putting words in a poetic form change the feeling, the simplicity, or the truth of them?
It doesn't. That assertion, some things you know all your life and that they must be said. Again, the more I think about that statement, the more I know, for example, if Shakespeare were writing this poem, he wouldn't say that because he could put anything in rhyme and meter and make it as powerful and as simple and beautiful as possible. I've often wondered why I said that in this poem, but I let it stick because I'm not the master craftsperson that William Shakespeare was, nor is there anybody else around today who is. The American critic Ezra Pound once said, poet and critic, if we could all write like Shakespeare, we wouldn't need modern poetry. We would just keep doing what he did, and poetry would be phenomenal.
Do you think poems are opportunities to try an idea on, to try something out, to go in some sort of new direction of thinking that you otherwise wouldn't take on?
I think if you want to stay alive as a writer, you want to move into areas that you haven't written about before. After all, the man who wrote that poem was not as old as I am now. He didn't know the exhaustion of being 84 years old, the weariness of old age, nor did he know the success that I've known. I think as I've changed as a person, my attitudes have changed as I've aged. I've met different people. My beliefs have changed. Yeah, I think if we're going to stay alive, not just as a poet, but as a human being, we have to change with what we come in contact with and what we want to do. And I've tried to stay alive. It's not as easy as it sounds, believe me. But I'm doing my best, friends.
Another question I just wanted to get to, because in that poem, the speaker says, I went away, and David Phillips from Laureate Union High School asks, Mr. Levine, what is your fascination with Spain? You mention it often in your poetry, and I'm guessing that was a mention of that time for you. What is your experience with that country?
I went to Spain in 1965 for a year. I took my wife and my 3 children, and we settled in Barcelona. And I chose Spain for 2 different reasons. One, it was inexpensive, and I could live on half salary because I was on a sabbatical from California State University, Fresno. So, and Barcelona was a city of great fascination for me. The Spanish Civil War was fought when I was a boy. It began in 1936, I believe June of 1936, or July of 1936. I was 8 years old. Young men from my neighborhood went to that war because they believed in the Spanish Republic, which was being overthrown by the army and other conservative forces in Spain that resented the modern movements of liberalization, because Spain had been a dictatorship, and then it became a republic. And there were those who lost power when it became a republic, when it became a democratic country. And the war began with their effort to seize power. And a young man who was a very close friend of mine's older brother went to that war and died. Never came home. First reported missing in action, but we all knew what that meant. And so that war really was part of my growing up. And the literature of that war is extraordinary. Also, I knew that the Spanish language contained in the 20th century, both from Spain and Latin America, absolutely incredible poetry. And I wanted to learn the language, to master it, and to come into contact with that great poetry, very different from our own poetry. I think in the 20th century there are 3 languages which give us incredible poetry: Spanish, Polish, and English. I'm probably ignorant of what went on in much of Asia, but I know those 3 languages were extraordinary.
Well, speaking of places far and wide, why don't we go to Our Valley, which is the final poem Mr. Levine will be reading from. It is from his newest book, News of the World.
The valley I'm talking about is the San Joaquin Valley, which is Central California from Bakersfield, way up north, Redding, California. The Great Central Valley. Some of you are in Brawley, California, so you know what it's like. It is very different from the California that you see on television and in films. The ocean is nowhere near us. The summers are very hot and dry, and the winters tend to be foggy and misty. And I went there to live in 1958, and I still live there. There is, in the middle summer, a yearning for what is beyond the valley, a yearning for that sea air that we know is just on the other side of the coastal range. On the eastern side, of course, is the Sierra Nevadas and the rest of the United States, but we don't dream about that. You can't cross them the way you can cross the coastal plain. And the Pacheco Pass is the pass you take if you're in Fresno and you want to get to the ocean, or you want to get to San Francisco, if you want to get in the summer, to a more pleasant world. Our valley. We don't see the ocean, not ever. But in July and August, when the worst heat seems to rise from the hard clay of this valley, you could be walking through a fig orchard when suddenly the wind cools and for a moment you get a whiff of salt. And in that moment, you can almost believe something is waiting beyond the Pacheco Pass, something massive, irrational, and so powerful, even the mountains that rise east of here have no word for it. You probably think I'm nuts saying the mountains have no word for ocean. But if you live here, you begin to believe they know everything. They maintain that huge silence we think of as divine, a silence that grows in autumn when snow falls slowly between the pines and the wind dies to less than a whisper, and you can barely catch your breath because you're thrilled and terrified. You have to remember, this isn't your land. It belongs to no one, like the sea you once lived beside and thought was yours. Remember the small boats that bobbed out as the waves rode in, and the men who carved a living from it only to find themselves carved down to nothing? Now you say this is home. So go ahead. Worship the mountains as they dissolve in dust. Wait on the wind. Catch a scent of salt. Call it our life.
The first follow-up question we have is from Brawley Union High School again on this poem. The question is, in Our Valley, silence is described as divine. Why do you think of silence as being divine?
Probably for 2 reasons. One reason is that human beings who are not divine talk all the time. You can't get them to shut up. We talk. We speak to God if we believe in God. We speak to God. We don't hear an answer. As a young person, when I found myself, let's say, conventionally religious and prayed, which is something I haven't done in a long time, I never got an answer. I think when I began praying, I thought there would be some kind of answer. It wouldn't be loud, but it would be in my head. And then I would be silent and hear nothing. So I began to think of silence as somehow divine and somehow beyond my own doing, my own ability. As you can see right now, or have seen for the last half hour, I'm a chatterbox. You know, I talk a lot. I enjoy talking. I'm human, you know. So I think of chatterboxes as people. And I have some friends who almost say nothing. And I begin to think of them, my God, they have so much power. They have so much power they don't have to say a word. Yeah. These are unique visions of mine. You might call them a little strange or eccentric. I guess eccentric is the word. It doesn't judge me.
Well, interestingly, as a follow-up question to that, we did get a Twitter question from Whitmore Branch Library. The question is, why is it important to read poetry aloud?
It's not. I perform poetry in the theater of my head. I can read a poem and know how it sounds. And if you read enough poetry, you will begin to hear how it sounds. There are occasions, for example, 2 days ago, I read a poem that had been in anthologies for years, Mr. Flood's Party by Edward Arlington Robinson. And I read it, and I loved the taste of it. It was just a marvelous poem. And so I said to my wife, I want to read you a poem. And she sat down, and I said, sit down. And, you know, I gave a little reading for her. And it was fun to do it. It was fun to taste that language. I think sometimes it is essential. And there are poems that were written to be heard. There are other poems that are written to be understood or to visualize. But there are poems, it's true, there are poems that you don't quite get unless you can really hear them. And I always read my own poems to myself. And then I read them to my wife. And then she says, not bad. No, I'm kidding. It's a mixed bag. I think, for me, you know, I'm on the subway, and I always travel on the subway in New York City with a book of poems, so I have something to read when the train stalls between stations and we sit there for a half an hour. I have to have something to read so I don't go crazy. I don't read those poems aloud. I don't want the people saying, who's this guy? Won't he shut up? I read them to myself, and I hear them. Of course, I've already read them before for the most part, and so I know how they're going to sound. As a beginner, I think you want to read them. You want to read them aloud. You want to read them and see how they feel in your mouth. It's a sensual pleasure that you get from it.
Well, thanks for all three of those poems and your responses. We do have a good bit of time for you to ask questions. We wanted to open up the possibility of either you asking questions via Twitter feed or being brave and electing to personally, via video conference, ask our Poet Laureate a question. So I'm wondering if anyone out there in the World Wide Web connected to us has a question they'd like to ask.
You know, as I look at those handsome people on the island of Honolulu, I know, I can see their intelligence. I can, like the woman second from the right. I mean, you can see in her face, or the woman sitting next to her, or the guy in the blue shirt, you can see intelligence and sensitivity. Yeah. And I know he's got a question.
Oh, I bet you do, guy in the blue shirt. What's your question? Come on, guy in the blue shirt. There you go. You can do it. Can we get the sound for you, please? Yeah, you. No, you
Hi,
right
can you
there.
guys?
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep, you. You
Okay.
waving your hand. Ask that question.
Okay, do you believe that members of today's generation have lost touch with the wisdom of nature?
I'm afraid I didn't.
I'll tell you. He asked if you believe that members of today's generation have lost touch with nature. That's the question, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Well, when you say today's generation, you mean people your age. Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. Even my grandchildren are older than you. So I've lost touch with your generation. But judging from what I know, from what I've inherited, I think to a degree we don't have the contact, for example, with animals that we once had. For example, when I was a boy, there were a lot of animals in the city living there. I mean, the milk trucks came in the morning, they were pulled by horses, you know? So you saw horses. Down the alley came the bone and rag man in a wagon pulled by a horse. I saw mules. I saw donkeys. I saw lots of, you don't see that anymore. So there was a loss of the familiarity of animals. And even when you went to eat the animal, when you went to buy the animal to eat, there was an animal there. It wasn't a plastic package that said chicken on it. I remember a couple of years ago, I went to a supermarket to get something. And my wife wanted me to get something from the butcher. So I went, and there was a woman ahead of me. And she wanted a stewing chicken. And so she talked to the butcher and told him. And so the butcher came out holding a dead chicken. And the little boy said to his mother, "Look, Mom, a chicken in the shape of a chicken." In other words, the thing that was usually wrapped in plastic now looked like a creature. And I thought, my God, we've gotten so far from what chicken really is. We eat it without knowing it was once a living creature. Yes, so the answer is yes, we have gotten too far from nature. Yeah.
Your famous. Thank you very much, and thank you, Moana Lua. You're famously a poet of urban life, a poem of working Detroit, and yet you've written a lot of poems about nature. Nature plays a big role in your poetry. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those two, the urban and the natural world.
Well, I think I owe a lot of that to my wife. My wife is a rural person. We've been married 50-some years now. And so I think it's a pretty good marriage. I think it's going to last till the end. And she's rural. And she'd be a very unhappy woman if she couldn't put her hands into the dirt. She loves to grow things. And you know, even as a boy, during World War II, we had victory gardens. And we were encouraged to find an empty lot and grow tomatoes, grow corn, grow whatever. I grew radishes because they grew, and carrots. I chose things that anybody could grow. So I was gardening, but not the way my wife does. My wife is, and my wife, you know, if I walk down the street with her, and there are trees, she knows, you know, the name of every tree and the history of it. And she knows all the flowers and gets such a delight. And we go into the mountains a lot because we live near the Sierra Nevadas. And again, she makes me familiar with what's there and the wealth of what's there and the magic and mystery of what's there. She's done a hell of a lot for me.
Well, along those lines, I suppose, comparing yourself to your wife, here's a question from Winder Barrow High School via Twitter. Do you think you view life differently as a poet?
Differently than a non-poet, I'm assuming. right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, take you and your wife.
Yeah, but you know, she's a woman and I'm a man, so right away we don't see things the same way. And she's smarter than I, so she sees things more. She's more generous. She's a much more generous person, much more soulful person. I'm a bit selfish.
You're pretty generous and pretty soulful, though.
See, I said all that so he would say this. You know.
I can tell you that.
That's how you fish for compliments. Yeah, I think you do. That is to say, I go out into the world, and New York is wonderful for this, and I listen to people talking. I want to use their language. I want to hear what they're saying. I want to catch the rhythm of American speech, which I think is just marvelous. When I lived in Barcelona, for example, and then later in Malaga, in Spain, I felt at times so cut off from poetry because I was cut off from the living language, English. I mean, as well as I learned Spanish, I wasn't a native. I didn't get the nuances of speech at all. And I yearned to hear Americans speaking. And I remember once an aircraft carrier came into the harbor of Barcelona, and there were, you know, hundreds of Marines and sailors having a good time in the city, and I was in a cafe, and there were a bunch of sailors there and Marines, and I saw some hustlers trying to separate them from their luggage, you know, so they could steal it. And I went up to this one young man and I said, if I were you, I wouldn't ignore that bag you put down. You just keep your eye on it. And he said, why? And I said, why? Because if you have something valuable in there, it's going to be gone, you know? You're having a good time drinking and you're not paying attention. Come on. And then some people got a little angry at me because I was ruining their ploy. And there was a little anger going on back and forth, and the potential hoodlums left. And the sailor came over to me and he said, where did you learn such good English? And I said, Detroit. Oh, what were you doing there? And I said, being born, growing up. Oh, you're an American. And they were stunned that I was an American. What are you doing here? And I said, I'm living here. Oh, okay. Then I said to him, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm in the Navy. Okay, I'm in the Civilian Corps, researching poetry.
Alpena County isn't so far, presumably, from Detroit, and we have a question from Alpena County's George and Fletcher Library. The question is, I grew up near Detroit. Can you talk about how life in the industrial heartland influenced your work?
Oh, yeah. When I came of age, during the end of World War II, when I looked for work, almost anyone could get work in Detroit because there were so many men who weren't there. They'd gone off to war. And so I got a lot of jobs that paid quite well. And, you know, all you had to do was lie about your age. And they wanted you to lie about, you know, you didn't have to produce anything to prove how old you were. And so I did that work. And, of course, it influenced the way I felt about life. There was a certain kind of passivity that was encouraged. For example, that poem I read, What Work Is. It also grew out of something else. It grew out of responding to an ad excuse me, for labor. I read in the Sunday paper that they were looking for people to work at Fort Highland Park. And they asked you to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, to get a job. And I was there, bright and early at 8 o'clock. But they weren't. We could see the office, and it was locked, and the line grew longer and longer. And there was this misty rainfall, and one got, angrier and angrier, because it said 8, and now it's 9. It opened at about 9:30. We'd been out there an hour and a half. And I thought, why did they do this to us? They knew perfectly well when they were going to open. So I asked myself that question. Why was that done? And the answer that came back was, they wanted to hire people who were willing to stand in the rain for an hour and a half. They wanted the more docile ones. And I was so angry by this time. I may have been wrong, by the way, but that's what I figured. When I finally you walked in, and there were several desks with men sitting behind the desk. And you went up to a desk by turns, and they would ask you a few questions. So I go up to the desk. This is another half hour, so it's now I've been waiting 2 hours. And the man asks me my age and my experience and my social security number, and produced the card, and he writes that down. And then he said to me, "What job would you like here?" Well, the ad said assembler. That's basically the lowest level, no skill needed. Assembler. But I didn't say assembler. I said, "I'd like to have your job. I'd like to be able to sit behind a desk and make other people wait 2 hours in the rain so I could boss them around." I couldn't resist it. I thought, I don't want to work for these people. They have no regard for me, no respect. And that, I think, was an indication of how industry can treat people who aren't unionized, who aren't organized, who don't know their own rights, who can't bond together and stick up for the dignity of labor. It was a crucial experience for me, and it shaped who I am and how I look at the world.
The Twitter gods have told me that Fox Chapel Area High School has 2 questions. Maybe we can pull Fox Chapel Area High School up on the screen and see what those 2 questions are. Right now we have Moana Lua. Nice to still see you guys, but we should get, can we get, hi. Fox Chapel High School, can we get you? Fox Chapel High School. Maybe not. Maybe we'll save those questions.
Don't just pass over Fox Chapel. They've waited a long time.
I would love to have Fox Chapel.
You don't have the question.
No, they're supposed to ask it in person, as Moana Lua did. I'll tell you what. While we're waiting for that, let's ask it. Since we have Moana Lua up, someone there wrote in and said, looking at your older poetry, what would you say to your younger self?
I guess the first word I'd say is thanks. Who asked it? But will the person who asked that question raise his or her hand? Okay, go. I would say thank you for writing. I think my best work I wrote probably when I was in my 50s. I had really learned how to do it, and I had terrific energy, and so I'm very thankful for that guy who in his 50s really was dedicated and worked very hard and wrote as well as he did. So I would thank you. My poetry's changed, of course, but I actually like that work better than what came later, although what came later received all these awards. But I think the judges should have seen how much better the early work was and given me awards then. But I'm not complaining. I'm glad I got it. I'm glad I'm the Poet Laureate of the United States.
Yeah.
Even at 84. Yeah.
If only you could have been poet laureate at 50, what fun we would have had.
How about at 16?
Yeah, that was a few years before I was born, unfortunately. I'm supposed to ask for Fox Chapel to start speaking and see if we can hear you if you start speaking. So can someone from Fox Chapel who has a question raise their hand first? Let's see where you are, Fox Chapel. We can't see you. Maybe you could ask a question and we'll see if we can hear it. I don't think that's going to work. Let's move on to another question from Winter Barrow High School. Someone writes in and says, you've mentioned your wife several times and reading poetry to her. Is sharing your poetry an important part of your writing process?
Not so much of the process. Well, if